What's up, everyone? I am here at the writing desk, got the camera faced towards me today because I wanted to talk to you about a podcast I listened to recently. Thought it was relevant to this channel. It is the Ink Tank podcast, which is hosted by David Grimes and Michael Gebhardt, two amazing calligraphers. And the podcast is focused on the tradition of American penmanship, which is something that's very much related to what I'm doing here because, the type of cursive that I'm teaching and talking about here on my YouTube channel and demonstrating is business penmanship, which is the classic traditional American cursive that was taught in the early 1900s. And their podcast goes really deep into that tradition of American penmanship. And the latest episode, their second episode, which I was glad to see them put out, went into some interesting topics. It kind of just, after I listened to it, I was like, man, I want to say something back to them and maybe start a conversation or just kind of continue the conversation with my audience and see where it goes from there. I mean, that's what podcasts are all about, and it's really great to see their podcast popping up. You have the calligraphy podcast. You can find them on Instagram. It's another podcast that's popping up. And you also have the Calligraphy Masters podcast. So the penmanship calligraphy community has some great outlets for content that are being released. And it's great to see, these, obviously calligraphy is a world where everybody's producing content in the form of art. But you don't have a lot of people actually producing, or they're also producing content in the form of instruction too. And now it's great to see these podcasts pop up because this is a place where, they might get a little bit into instruction and tips and tricks, but it's also a place for people that love penmanship and calligraphy just to talk about it, talk about their love for it, about the art, about the history of it, which is really great and fun. So I just wanted to make this video and hit on a couple things that they talked about in episode 2, which was called the Dream Nib Crisis. And it was a really interesting topic because, especially in the pointed pen world, nibs are something that they're a problem right now. It's not, I would say we have a good nib situation, but it's not a great nib situation, and it could be a lot better. Obviously, there might be a lot of things that are holding it back right now, which I can get into. And, one thing they talked about was nib quality control. Specifically, they they named the Gillot 303, which is a modern nib, and just how I think Michael said he bought some a while back and half of them maybe were defective, and I've certainly experienced that with the Gillot 303, which is a somewhat popular nib. And I think an even more popular nib that I've experienced similar issues with is the Leonard Principal EF nib, which is, I love the performance of this nib when it's not defective, but I think I've probably bought 30 to 50 of these nibs over the last 3 years, and it seems like every other one I pick up is very much defective. I mean, I could write with it, but it's very annoying to write with. Either the tines are just split apart and there's a gap there, or the slit in the nib is off center, so it just wears down and doesn't produce a great line. Something's wrong with these nibs, and whoever's making them, I thank you for making them, because when they're good, they're great. It produces a super fine hairline. It's probably one of the closest nibs we have to something that people that are doing ornamental penmanship want. It has the properties that we want. Maybe it's a little stiff for most people, but it has that fine line. It has the flexibility, but the quality control is terrible. And it's just unfortunate because it's also a more expensive nib. It's $225, $250, depending on where you buy it. And it just seems like it should, with that premium price, it should also have better quality control, but it does not. And I'm not really sure what we can do about this. I've never thought about this idea, but Odd Job over at the Calligraphy podcast, different podcast than the Ink Tank, she actually mentioned to me, I think it was her, it could have been Kristen. She was responding under their Instagram handle, so I don't know if it was Odd Job or Kristen. Regardless, credit to them. They said, hey, you ever thought about returning your nibs to the seller? And I never had. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, if you buy any type of product, if it's defective when you get it, you have the right to return that and get your money back. Most sellers will give you that right because it's good for business. So I reached out to Paper Ink and Arts, and I asked them if they would take nibs back, and they said that they usually do. I don't know exactly what that means, so I guess we have to try it. It's still not a great solution because it's annoying. I mean, it sounded like they didn't even want me to return the nibs physically. I just need to tell them, like, hey, I bought 10 nibs, Leonard EFs, and 5 of them are defective, and they would refund that, for the 5 nibs. It sounds like that's what they would do. I'm not 100% sure. Even if that's the case, though, it's still not very convenient because, one, you're putting the money up front for the nibs, and you have to get it back, whatever, and you have to send them an email. Not a big deal. But 2, it's kind of hard. I mean, I can look at a nib, and I can kind of tell, like, maybe this isn't going to be a good nib, but I can't do that with 100% accuracy. Like, I need to clean it and try to write with it before I really know, like, all right, is this nib going to be good or not? Because sometimes a nib looks good with visual inspection, and then you try it and it turns out to be a dud. So I don't know if that's the greatest solution here, but I would encourage other people to try it. I'm going to try it because I'm going to buy some more EFs soon, and maybe that'll put pressure. If people start doing this and returning nibs, maybe somehow that could put pressure on either the sellers or the manufacturers themselves to add some type of quality control check into their process. It's just a shame with these modern nibs that, they're getting pumped out at such a high rate. I'm not really sure how they can't visually inspect every nib. But, I mean, obviously the problem is with the actual manufacturing process. There must be some way it's probably expensive to figure out how to not produce so many defective nibs. And the money's just not there to fix that part of the process to decrease that defective rate. So who knows? I'm not in the nib manufacturing process, so I'm not going to criticize it too much here. I just, it's a problem and it needs to be fixed. I don't know if it ever will be, but maybe returning our nibs is one possible way to get that going in the right direction. I want to talk about one other part of the podcast here, and then we'll wrap it up. I'm going to ramble on like I normally do, so we'll just keep going here. The kind of the second part of the podcast, I mean, well, they did talk about the difference between modern and vintage nibs, which was really interesting, which is why I encourage you to go listen to the podcast. They did get into vintage nibs and kind of the dream point problem, which dream point or dream nibs is a term that was coined by Dr. Joe Votolo. And he kind of laid out like 6 nibs, vintage nibs, that he thinks are really like the best of the best vintage nibs. These are the nibs that, the best penmen in the early 1900s were using. And these are the nibs that you want to look out for and try to buy and find. And I guess the problem here is that before he put out this information with these 6 dream points, you could find these nibs for relatively cheap, like $2 to $5 on eBay per nib. And after he did that, everybody kind of found out about these nibs and everybody wanted them. And it definitely inserted a lot of demand into the market for these nibs, and their price went way up. Over $10 a nib. I think $13 or $15 a nib is kind of the average price you'll see for a Jalop Principality, for example. That's probably the most popular vintage nib that most people can name, is that Jalop Principality. And you can't find it for less than 13 or so a nib. And, Michael and David kind of talked about it. And I've heard other calligraphers or penmen in this community kind of gripe about this. I don't know if David and Michael were griping so much. They actually provided a really nuanced take on this, as opposed to just like these sellers they're extorting the community. They're exploiting the situation. They have these nibs, they don't even want to use them. They just want to sell them and make money. That's not the take the Ink Tank podcast gave. That's just a take that I've heard elsewhere, that I disagree with completely. I think the problem here is that these nibs are old. They're historical. They're kind of historical artifacts. I don't know how many are out there in supply. Nobody really knows that. If anybody does, I'd love to hear what that guess might be, because I think that information would probably help the whole market kind of figure out what the price of these nibs really should be and whether or not, there is any price gouging going on. But I don't think it's a big. I think the problem really is that because these nibs are so rare and old and historical, there's competition between penmen that want to use them to write with because they're excellent nibs to write with, and historical collectors that want to collect these items and add them to their collection and preserve them. So you have this competition going on, and I think, at $13 a nib, that's a price that most calligraphers and penmen are not going to pay to write with a nib, because not only are you paying that much, you're also decreasing the value of the nib when you write with it. So you're buying something for $13 a nib, and then you're making it almost essentially worthless after you write with it. And, just basically, it doesn't destroy it. It's still worth something, but it's not worth the $13 anymore. So you're really, you're eating that whole $13 if you decide to write with it. So it's just not very economical to write with a principality right now, which is, I agree, it's annoying, and it'd be nice if there was millions and millions of vintage principalities out there and we could buy them for, $2 or $4 a nib, and we could all write with them and our penmanship would look that much better because we're writing with these great nibs. But it's just not the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is that these nibs are in short demand. Whether they really are or not, the ones that are out there being sold are being sold for the price they are. People are buying them for that price for whatever reason, whether to use them or collect them. And we just have to deal with it. I think, there's nothing we can do. When Dr. Joe put that list out, he put information out there in the market. People didn't know about these nibs. They didn't know how special these nibs are. And now that he put that information out, everybody knows how special they are, and people are willing to pay for them. And I'm not going to say that I have a right to use these nibs as a penman is more important than the right of somebody to collect them as a collector. Or that my right as a penman of a certain status is more important than the right of some other penman that has more money than me and can blow it on a bunch of nibs. I think prices are really, I don't want to get into economics here, but prices are really mysterious, beautiful things. They measure what's going on in a market, and I'm not going to attempt to decrypt and demystify everything that price is taken into consideration. There's all types of motivations going on in a market, and $13 a nib is where it's landed at, and it's just something we have to accept. So, and I think there are some positives to the $13 a nib. I think that's something that a lot of calligraphers don't even think about. They just think oh, this nib's too expensive and I can't use it. Well, think about it this way too. These are historical artifacts, these nibs. They're not being made anymore. So there is some limited amount of supply. And if they were still being sold for $4 a nib, there'd be a bunch of people buying them, using them, throwing them away, not taking care of them. There'd be a lot of people, that wouldn't value them as much because they were bought for $4 a nib. And now when they're bought for $13, you really have to think. People that are buying these really have to think before they buy them, and to say is this something I really want? So I think at that higher price point, these nibs are arguably going into the hands of people that care more about the nibs. They're going to do a better job of preserving them for the future. So that's just one positive that I think gets overlooked a lot. It wasn't brought up in the podcast. What are the positives of that $13 price? So, again, I think Ink Tank, Michael, and David they provided a lot more nuance to this topic. So don't act I'm not acting like they were just griping and complaining about the price. They did a great job of explaining the situation and giving their thoughts on it. So really interesting conversation. I think the great solution for everybody is if one of these nib manufacturers would figure out how to produce a principality, a modern principality that's actually just like the principality. Maybe each nib does receive some personal care by a nib technician, Maybe it is manually ground down. Uh, and maybe they cost $5 a nib for a new modern Principality. I think people would pay that. People would pay, especially the penman, and it would solve this problem beautifully because we could still have the vintage Principalities that people would collect and put on display and keep in their collections, and then we would have the modern Principality that performs, just like it or very close to it, and maybe it's the most expensive modern nib out there. Maybe it's $6 a nib. I think people would pay for that. There's people that care so much about their nibs and they want to write with the tools that are very similar to what people wrote like in the early 1900s. I think people would pay for that. I would certainly buy some and try them out. And if they could make them with the type of quality assurance that was made back in the day, back in the early 1900s, you're already paying $250 for a Principal EF, and half of them don't work. So unless you're refunding them, you're basically spending $5 a nib for a Principal EF unless you're getting refunded. So I would much rather pay $5 for a nib that, a Principality, modern Principality that everyone's going to that's going to work and be great, than do this song and dance with the Leonard Company producing these 50% defective nibs. So that's my thoughts. I'm going to leave it there. I've gone long enough here. I'll just encourage you to check out the podcast. Again, it's Ink Tank, and it's hosted by David Grimes and Michael Gebhardt. The production value is awesome. David's like an audio whiz, and they're very organized. They have their talking points and they have their ideas and their opinions and sharing great knowledge. So check it out. It's always great to see people producing content in this space. I'm just doing my little part here with my unproduced, barely even thought out videos. So please leave a comment if you think anything I said was wrong or incorrect, or you disagree with it. I've thought about what I was going to say here a little bit, but there's very well something that I just kind of came out of me in this video that, I didn't think through that closely. So I'm very open to disagreements and other ideas here. So definitely leave a comment if you have any thoughts. If you like the video, hit the subscribe button. Always good to have you in here and, getting alerts when I post new videos, which happens every other week or so. And hit the like button too if you like the video. And then you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Perfect Biscuits. Would love to see you there. And that is it for now. Thank you for watching.